Can you see me?
No.
Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes. Just let everyone get on and get online here and we'll get going.
CIC.
Yossi,
Yes,
what's the name of the initiative that you co-direct again?
the Muslim Leadership Initiative.
All right, guys, let's get started, okay? So I'm Rory Nissan. I'm a member of CIC Hamilton and a city councillor in Burlington, Ontario. Now, the CIC is the Canadian International Council, for those who don't know it. It's an independent, nonpartisan membership organization and a think tank. And well, the mission is essentially to nurture awareness and understanding of critical international affairs challenges and advancing constructive discourse and debate on how to address them, which is exactly what we're doing today. So really excited to have everyone joining on the call. We have very good attendance already, so that's great. And I think we've got people from Hamilton, GTHA, and really across the country, including Yossi joining us from Jerusalem. So it's a great topic, it's an important topic. I don't know about you guys, but I'm glad to not talk about COVID-19 for an hour, although we'll see if we can make it the whole hour without bringing it up. I somehow doubt it. But yeah, I don't know much about this topic. I know even less than Jared Kushner, I'd say. So I'm looking forward to learning from the panelists and our moderator. And our moderator today is Janice Stein. Dr. Stein is the Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. So just to save time, I'll post a link to her full bio in the chat and links to the other panelists' bios and Wikipedia pages as well. So I'll be in the chat to help promote the discussion, and just to note, there is a Q&A button. So depending on how Zoom friendly you are, you may not have seen this yet. So you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You just have to move your mouse to see it. And you can ask your questions there. And Janice will be watching that and will be bringing some of those questions forward. So we're booked for about an hour here. Finally, just before I throw it over to you, Janice, just my friendly reminder, if you're not a member of the Canadian International Council, we'd love for you to join us. I'll post a link in the chat. It's thecic.org. Look, it's cheap. You get a membership to the International Journal, member-only events, and yeah, we have a student discount and a young professionals price as well. So please consider joining us. It's our membership that really makes the CIC happen. So with that, over to you, Janice. Get us started. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very, very much. And it's a pleasure to welcome John Allen and Yossi Halevi Klein to this session. Just a brief word about each. And as you said, Rory, their bios are posted. Yossi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and also co-director with Imam Abdullah Tepli of the Muslim Leadership Initiative. John, I suspect, is well known to Canadians, a seasoned and experienced diplomat, served as Canada's ambassador to Israel, and is a senior fellow with the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and with the CIC that Rory just talked about. I'm going to ask them both to talk about the peace plan put forward by the Trump administration, its strengths and its weaknesses. But just before we do, one quick round to each of them. It's quite remarkable for seasoned observers of the Middle East to see the dramatic drop in violence over these last 6 weeks. John, is this unprecedented pandemic an extraordinary pathway to reducing the intensity of the conflict?
Thanks so much, Janice. Let me just start by thanking the CIC and encouraging all of you to join. It's a great organization. Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Janice, for moderating. And thank you, Yossi, as well. I wish that this were the beginning of peace in the Middle East, but I fear that COVID is a short prelude, and that once it's over, I fear that we may simply return to a number of the conflicts that exist. The Saudis have declared a ceasefire in Yemen, which is positive. Whether it was COVID related or a realization that they weren't going anywhere there is one thing. The Syrians may have almost won the battle, not the war, in Idlib, so that may be over. But I think in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is not a conflict of those natures, I don't think we're going to see peace break out in this part of the Middle East post-COVID. We just have to hope, actually, that Israel and the Palestinians get through this without a major outbreak, for example, in Gaza, where any spread of COVID could be disastrous given the huge population and the inability to distance.
Yossi, any more optimism coming from you in Jerusalem?
So yeah, I'll play devil's advocate. If John would have been more optimistic, I would have taken the pessimistic side. So I think that I agree with John that on the Palestinian-Israeli track, we are unlikely to see any substantive change. The passions are too deep. This is a 100-year conflict. Yes, Gaza is the looming nightmare, as it so often is. But I am optimistic about Israel's relationship with much of the Arab world. Even before the virus, we were seeing unprecedented relationships being formed between Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel and the Gulf states, Israel and Egypt, where a shared fear of an imperial Iran has really created an unprecedented relationship. And the hope is that that relationship can evolve into a political relationship. And I'm wondering if COVID might not be hastening that track. And that could have positive implications for the Israeli-Palestinian track, but indirect.
John, put the Trump peace initiative within this context and walk us through its strengths and weaknesses.
Thanks, Janice. I'll do that. I'll just say at the beginning that, sorry, Rory, but given the COVID crisis, issues like this Trump peace plan and even a unity government in Israel have moved far from the front pages for now. But like the US presidential election and who will win Wimbledon, I'm a big tennis fan, these issues are going to be back when we eventually reach the new normal. And you'll all be ahead of the curve then. And issues like the status of Jerusalem and annexation and what the US policy vis-a-vis this conflict are will definitely be back, certainly depending on what happens in the US election in November. So I'm going to talk today about why, like so many other very big deals President Trump has taken credit for, this plan is unlikely to see the light of day. Moreover, if by chance some parts of it were to move forward, and here I'm particularly concerned about the annexation element, annexation of the Jordan Valley in particular, I suggest it would bring neither peace nor stability to Israel and the Palestinians, peace and stability that both need. So at the end of January, Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu, with no Palestinian in the room, celebrated the announcement of the deal of the century at the White House. This much anticipated peace plan was, in my view, for Israel, a miracle, and for the Palestinians, a curse. So what was the political context in which the announcement was made? What does the plan look like? And what does it mean going forward? Well, first of all, we had an Israeli Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, that had just been formally indicted on 3 criminal charges, the most serious being fraud. Second, he was then and remains today a caretaker prime minister. Now, in international practice, this means that he should, except in an emergency situation, refrain from making any significant policy decisions, such as on spending or relations with other states. For example, neither an Israeli nor a Canadian prime minister, for that matter, can even appoint ambassadors during this caretaker period. Third, we had an Israeli election that was then about a month away, and the activities of the kind that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump were engaged in would normally be considered as interference in the election process. But of course, that's exactly what both leaders had hoped to achieve. Fourth, we had a president in the United States, then under impeachment, who was facing his own election in less than a year, and who announced a plan that essentially reverses US policies regarding the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians that have been in place under every president since Richard Nixon. Fifth, it's instructive to recall who attended the announcement at the White House. The front row included President Trump's ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, a longtime supporter, both politically and financially, of the settler movement, and Sheldon Adelson, an ardent supporter of Greater Israel, the settler movement, and a man who is reported to have donated $125 million to Republican candidates in 2016 and $25 million to the Trump campaign. Who else was there? The Kushners, of course, and the foremost leaders of the US evangelical community. The latter are the president's most faithful supporters, in large part because of his strong support for Israel. Finally, who wasn't present at the announcement? As noted, the Palestinians were absent, as they were throughout the entire negotiation process. Now, this is equivalent to the United States and Mexico negotiating and announcing the new NAFTA 2.0 trade agreement without Canada having participated in either the negotiations or the announcement. In sum, the president shored up his base, both with the evangelical movement and those Jews who support a greater Israel and the settlement enterprise. For his part, Bibi Netanyahu had hoped that he would shore up his support amongst his pro-settlement and pro-annexation base, and at the same time deflect attention from his indictment. The subsequent decision by the Trump administration to put a hold on any annexations has been a bit of a setback for Netanyahu in this regard. Now, let me quickly turn to the details of the plan. It was, in my view, crafted in a way that no Palestinian leader could possibly accept it. And I know that Yossi and I may have different views on this, so I look forward to his perspectives. Indeed, in my view, it was designed specifically so that Bibi Netanyahu and others in Israel who oppose the two-state solution could say, see, the Palestinians have missed yet another opportunity for peace. Moreover, whether it proceeds or not, in my view, it could lead Palestinians to ultimately reject any two-state solution. In lieu, they could advocate for the establishment of a one-state solution, a result that most Israelis will ultimately regret. Finally, this plan is classic Donald Trump. He claims it says one thing, and while the reality is very different. As he described the plan, it creates two states. It divides Jerusalem between the parties. It maintains the status quo on the Temple Mount or the Al-Aqsa site. It freezes the settlement project, and it offers Israel the security it requires. The reality is that each of these claims is untrue. So what does the plan say? We need to recall that since Oslo in 1993, most negotiations between the two sides revolved around 5 final status issues that both sides would have to compromise on if there was going to be a deal. In the Trump plan, each and every final status issue was decided in Israel's favor. First, the question of Jerusalem, which is probably the most important question for the Palestinians, the rest of the Arab world, and for Israel. In Trump's plan, all of what the world understands to be the city of Jerusalem and more was given to Israel. Contrary to what Trump said at the White House, Israel was even granted sovereignty over the Temple Mount Al-Aqsa Mosque while leaving its management in the hands of Jordan. For their part, the Palestinians were given their own Jerusalem, but it's a Jerusalem in name only. In fact, it's a no man's land of 3 neglected Arab villages, all located on the Palestinian side of the separation wall. This flies in the face of what most analysts have understood any deal ultimately had to agree on: East Jerusalem for the Palestinians and West Jerusalem for the Israelis. In fact, you may recall President Trump's last gift to Israel when he recognized that West Jerusalem was Israel's capital and moved his embassy there. At the time, he said this was simply recognizing facts on the ground, but that the fate of East Jerusalem was to be negotiated between Israel and the Palestinians. I guess he forgot he had said that. Issue 2.
Don, I wonder, we just have about 2 minutes left for the opener here, so you might want to pick just 1 or 2, and then I'll move to Yossi.
Well, I think I'm going to run through the 5 issues, Janice, and then Yossi can reply.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes.
Okay. Virtually all recent negotiations have used the pre-1967 border between Israel and Jordan as the starting point for negotiations. The Trump plan allows, in fact, Israel to retain and gives a green light to their annexation to all existing settlements currently recognized by Israel. Contrary to what Trump had stated, Israel is permitted to continue to expand those settlements. Now, this is really important. The plan also grants Israel sovereignty over the Jordan Valley and seemed to offer a green light to its annexation. The Jordan Valley represents 1/3 of the territory of the West Bank. If annexed, the landmass belonging to the Palestinians would be reduced to approximately 17% of the total area that was partitioned in 1947. Now, finally, the Trump plan goes one step further, and this is quite important. It suggests that parts of the Arab Triangle, an area of Palestinian Israeli cities within Israel, could be transferred with or without the Palestinian Israeli citizens currently living there to the new Palestinian state. In other words, in addition to creating an entity that is actually a series of separated Bantustans, the plan also contemplates the possibility of a version of ethnic cleansing for certain Palestinian Israeli citizens. On the issue of the right of return, of Palestinian refugees to their previous homes in Israel, it's generally been understood, if not by all Palestinians, that only a very limited number of Palestinians would be allowed to return to Israel. In Donald Trump's plan, no Palestinians would return to Israel, and there would be no recognition of what the Palestinians call their Nakba. I want to talk about the sovereignty of the Palestinian state.
John, I'm going to just ask you to hold that for a minute and go to Yossi now to make sure that we have time for Yossi and then time for the list of questions that's really building up here. So Yossi, 10 minutes to you now to respond.
So John, I wish that you and I disagreed more profoundly because it would make for a more interesting argument. There'd be fireworks. Where we differ is, I would say, more on nuance, and so I'll lay a couple of those out, and on the Trump plan, and then I'll speak briefly about the place of the Arab-Israeli minority, which has become a very important issue during this period, and perhaps I'll conclude with a word or two about the current coalition which has left Israel essentially without a functioning government. So in terms of the Trump plan, I see this as a plan that could have worked or could have at least been the starting point for negotiations if it had been presented as an interim agreement rather than a final status. It's this notion of trying to wrap up the conflict, which is the great temptation and the great downfall of the international community. This is the conflict that must be solved. And I don't know if the conflict can be solved. Certainly, I don't believe it can be solved in the near future. The conflict needs to be much better managed. And the Trump plan could have been an interesting interim agreement. When it was presented as a take it or leave it agreement, of course, it became a non-starter. Nevertheless, I think that the plan is useful in that it has been a wake-up call in very different ways. First, to the Israeli right, and I'm thinking specifically about the settlement movement, and secondly, to the Palestinian leadership. To the settler leaders, who, by the way, detest this plan. And I think that that's something really important to emphasize, because the way, John, the way that you presented it, one would have thought that this would be the ideal plan and the settlement movement would have been the first to endorse it. In fact, the settlement movement has been vehemently opposed, and they're not wrong from their point of view to oppose it, because this plan crosses two red lines for them. One, it allows the creation of a Palestinian state, however limited. One can argue that it's not a viable Palestinian state, and I agree with you on that, John. But nevertheless, it maintains the principle of a two-state solution. And the fact that Trump, who is the most pro-Israeli right American president that we've ever had, still comes up with a plan that is based on some kind of Palestinian statehood has been a major blow to the settlement movement. And the second, maybe even more important point here, is that what settlement leaders understand is that while the plan leaves all settlements in place, it would create a dynamic in which settlements that are isolated and embedded within the future Palestinian state would have no ability to grow, and the plan is essentially a death sentence for many settlements, and so for those and other reasons, the settlement movement has been a very strong opponent of the plan. The wake-up call to Palestinian leaders is that you can't keep saying no to plans, which Palestinian leaders have been doing since the Peel Commission plan of 1937, and expect the map to get larger. In fact, the trend since 1937 is that every Palestinian rejection has led to a shrinking of the map the next time a plan is presented. And so the Trump plan, which again, I agree with you, John, is not viable for a Palestinian state. But there's something here that the Palestinian public, if not the leadership, should be internalizing, which is there's a price to pay for almost a century of rejection. The Palestinian leadership has never presented a clear, coherent, systematic plan of its own. It did endorse the Arab 2002, the Saudi plan of 2002, but that's a very vague plan. We have never heard from Palestinian leaders a detailed plan, what the map is going to look like, how many refugees. It's time for us to hear some concrete position from the Palestinian leadership instead of no, no, no. Mahmoud Abbas, in his response to the Trump plan, was 1,000 no's. And Israelis heard that and just shrugged and laughed and said, you know, manish tana, as we say on Passover. Why is this plan different from any other plan? Every plan has been followed by 1,000 no's. And so this as well, even though, again, this plan, I think, does deserve a Palestinian no, though I think the Palestinians might have been better served had they said something like, well, this plan cannot be the basis for a final status, but how about if we look at this as an interim agreement? Instead of always saying no, and then having the international community serve as a kind of amen chorus to every Palestinian rejection, how about a little bit of a creative maybe? That might have really taken us to a different place. So that's all that I really have to say.
Yossi, just before, could you tell us a little bit about the unprecedented situation that is now developing in Israel with respect to its government?
Yes, yes. This is really what's on people's minds here. You know, we have been through 3 national elections in the space of 1 year, and we still have no conclusive result. Now, Netanyahu has a block of 59 members of parliament. He needs 61 to form a government. Benny Gantz, in principle, had 61, but Benny Gantz is the head of the blue and white centrist party. I won't go into all the dynamics, but the 61 that appeared on paper was actually not a viable coalition. And so Benny Gantz decided to do something extraordinary, which is to essentially break up his own party and try to negotiate a coalition government with Netanyahu, breaking his promise over the last year to voters like myself who have been loyal supporters for 3 elections of Gantz and Blue and White. And that the Blue and White coalition existed for one purpose and one purpose only: to stop Netanyahu, to save Israeli democracy, because we perceive, those of us in the Blue and White camp, perceive Netanyahu as a clear and present danger to Israeli democracy. And now Gantz effectively betrayed his constituency and is trying to negotiate a coalition agreement. Now, I say betrayed his constituency with a certain understanding of his position, because his argument has been that in a state of national emergency, you need a functioning government. And so he has tried to act the statesman, soldier that he once was, and to negotiate a unity government with Netanyahu. He has done so in a disastrously amateurish way. And the result is that we do not have a government. President Ruby Rivlin has turned to Parliament and said, you figure this out, an unprecedented situation. And so we have no functioning government. If this situation continues for the next 3 weeks, which is all the time left to create a government, we will be going to 4th elections in the middle of a national disaster.
That's just an unbelievable story, I think, for listeners. When voting itself is an activity that can be dangerous as voters line up. This is a looming election in the United States as well. So it's really an unbelievable story, Yossi. And it leads directly to the first question from our live audience. What are the underlying conditions for peace that may come to the fore if Bibi is no longer Prime Minister of Israel and Donald Trump is no longer President of the United States? We could be there, certainly in Israel, and that is conceivable in the United States, certainly. John, you start us off. How much difference do the leaders at the top make here? And were there a Democratic president in the United States, Joe Biden, and a change of leadership? Yossi, it's difficult to imagine who that is right now, but if we got a change in leadership up at the top, how much would change here? John, to you first.
Well, I think in the United States, there's no question you would see an immediate return to support for the two-state solution under a Democratic leadership and presidency. And the Trump plan, in essence, would be thrown out. I think if you had new leadership in Israel, somebody that actually believed in the possibility of negotiating a peace with the Palestinians, which Bibi Netanyahu has never had, then you have the beginning of a conversation. Certainly, the leadership in the Palestinian Authority has to change before we have any hope of reaching a negotiation. I don't disagree with Yossi in the sense that the Palestinians have not put forth a plan. I disagree significantly that any acceptance of this plan was a non-starter. There's no point in trying to negotiate with either Bibi or Donald Trump, but there certainly is a basis for negotiation if the settlements were to stop expanding, and if the Palestinians had new leadership that could begin to bridge the differences between Hamas and Fatah, and was serious, as Yossi suggested, about putting forth what it needed. But the idea of Jerusalem would have to be divided, and there would have to be a real Palestinian state, not a series of Bantustans, etc. Unlike...
Just to finish that one, pop it over to Yossi to get
So
some conversation.
John, I'm delighted by your response because really it gives me a good basis for an argument. I think that you have summed up the wisdom of the international community on negotiations. All we need to do is resume where things left off. There's a basis for a two-state solution. We can negotiate a deal. Just stop those damn settlements, and we'll all be reasonable. It ain't gonna happen, John. There is no possibility of a two-state solution being negotiated directly between the Israelis and the Palestinians for this generation. And I say that categorically, and I'll go even further and say there is virtually no one in the state of Israel today who believes that what you just said is a possibility. That includes blue and white, rightward. Bear in mind that in Israel today, there is no left-right divide anymore. No left. The left has completely collapsed. There is a right-center divide. And on this issue, on whether the Palestinian leadership would be ready to negotiate a genuine peace agreement, there is no substantive difference between Benny Gantz and Netanyahu, which is to say the overwhelming majority of the Jewish-Israeli party. Now, what is possible? What is possible is what I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, which is deepening the relationship between Israel and the Arab countries. And through that relationship, Israel creating very carefully over the long term, not a quick two-state solution, but gradually beginning to pull back the settlement enterprise, gradually beginning to test the waters with Palestinian institutions. That's a generational project. That could be done together with the Saudis and the Gulf states, and on one condition. And that condition is that the trade-off is not peace between Israel and the Palestinians, because that's an illusion. The Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian national movement to this day deny the legitimacy of the Jewish people's right to national sovereignty in any borders.
Yossi, let me ask you to...
1 second, Janice. But the trade-off can be and should be normalization with the Arab world in exchange for a Palestinian state. That's a very different deal, and it shifts the focus in a different direction.
So our questioner, Paul Meyer, asked an elaboration of what you two have been talking about. He asked what difference the really unprecedented success of the joint list in the last election can make to this process. And let me add just a flip to that. We have a very ill and aging leader in the Palestine Authority. His leadership cannot last forever. What kind of leadership change beyond bridging the gap between Hamas and Fatah, which is a kind of almost rhetorical flourish? Let's look a little deeper inside. What kind of change within Palestinian political organizations could make a change here? So Yossi, first to you on the joint list, and then to John on changes inside the leadership. There are really talented people beneath the bus. Who do we see that could be a game changer here? To you first, Yossi.
In terms of the joint list, it will have no impact on the Israeli-Palestinian front, but it will potentially have great impact on bringing the Arab minority closer into the Israeli mainstream. That, I think, is a very significant development. Benny Gantz will leave us with one essential legacy, and that is he's the first Israeli leader to actually negotiate the possibility of a coalition agreement with the Arab parties. Now, it failed for all kinds of reasons, but a psychological obstacle has been crossed, and the Israel that we will inherit after this crisis is over, these multiple crises are over, I think will present us with real opportunities.
John, on changes inside the Palestinian Authority and new talented leaders.
Before I go there, let me just say that I disagree, Yossi. I disagree because in terms of where the Israeli electorate is at. For 30 of the last 40 years, Israel's been led by Likud, by a far-right leadership who had no interest in a two-state solution. And if they had leadership that was more interested in seeking a relationship with the Palestinians, then I think you would see a change in the electorate because they would see the possibilities of hope. That, of course, relies on changes, which Janice wants me to talk about, of leadership in the Palestinian Authority. I also think that the great pessimism about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is it's something that Israelis, it's almost an ego thing with the Israelis. You know, South Africa and apartheid, nobody thought it was going to end, and it ended 50 years before journalists there thought it would end. Nobody thought that the Berlin Wall was going to come down in '89, and it came down. And nobody thought that the Catholics and the Protestants were ever going to do a deal. But for some reason, the Israelis and the Palestinians have this view that their conflict is so complex and there is so much religion and so much property involved that one can never find a solution. I disagree. And what it needs is leadership. And what it needs in the Palestinian Authority is young leadership, is new leadership. It's not going to be easy because there's corruption that's entrenched. There are old tribes that have to be overcome. It's not going to be easy. But with the help of the Saudis, turning to the Saudi plan, which may not be detailed, but it does cover the key issues. And it did basically say that the Arab world would agree to recognize Israel if those basic conditions could be met. I think there is a possibility. And finally, I would disagree, Yossi. The Palestinian Authority has recognized at many times the state of Israel. What they're not prepared to recognize is Israel as a Jewish state. And given that there's 20% of Israelis who are not Jewish, I think it's not an unreasonable position. They recognize Israel as a state. Israel recognizes them as a state, not as a Muslim state, and we move on. This is not easy, but it's also not unsolvable.
So picking up on John's last comment, Yossi, you talked about the Saudi plan of 2002 being vague and not really a plan. Nevertheless, it is the first plan put forward in generations by Arab leaders and by an Arab leader of some significance. What would have to happen? And you talked about the importance for the broader Arab context here. What would have to happen for that plan to be the beginning of a meaningful political initiative? Make it more granular for us. That's to Yossi. Yossi.
The first thing is that the Arab world would have to present the plan not as a take it or leave it diktat, which is how it was presented, but as the opening gambit for negotiations. And I would have wanted to see an Israeli government say that, rather than respond with our own rejection. I would have liked to see an Israeli government say, we're willing to negotiate on the basis of this plan, provided that it is a plan that can be negotiated. So that, I think, for me, that's the basic issue. And my sense is, and I've heard this from people who are in touch with the Saudis, that there is a willingness to rethink that approach, which again leads us back to the position that I laid out a little earlier, which is that negotiations need to begin over a two-state solution between Israel and the Arab world, not between Israel and a Palestinian leadership that no one in Israel trusts, and a Palestinian leadership that, yes, has formally said we accept Israel, but whose media, schools convey on a daily basis the message to the Palestinian people that the Jews are evil, the Jews have no right to exist, the Jews are an alien presence, and they will one day be driven out of Palestine.
So I'm going to ask both of you in response to several questions from our viewers, because we are in our final 10 minutes now of the hour. Let me start with you, John, and to shift this conversation in a more optimistic vein. Walk us through a scenario where some meaningful negotiations could get started. Yossi, I think, makes a valid point that a focus on a solution and an end game has often got in the way of some very creative opportunities that have been missed. But walk us through a scenario that that's not wildly unreasonable, that you think is within the realm of possibility, that could start a process going between Israel and Palestine. And then I'm going to ask Yossi the same question.
Well, although Yossi seems to suggest it was naive, I think that it has to start with the end of the settlement expansion. You can't sit at a table with somebody and share a pizza and have one side keep taking your pieces of the pizza and then say, this really isn't an obstacle to peace. Settlement expansion, which is eating away at whatever Palestinian state there may be, is one of the major obstacles. So take that off the table. And then I think have the Palestinians step up and realize and agree that a full-scale return is not happening, because that would be the end of the Jewish state, and that can't happen. So let them state that. They don't have to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Simply let them state that a small number could come back and the others would be compensated. Let Israel, and this is not an easy one, but let Israel accept that there will have to be a division of Jerusalem, and that East Jerusalem would be the capital of the Palestinian state. And I fully agree with Yossi. I think the importance of having other major Arab states jump in and get behind this in a moderate way would be great. Unfortunately, and this is unfortunate for the Palestinians and for the conflict, they have been nowhere in this conflict. They have essentially abandoned the Palestinians. They are much more interested, as Yossi suggested, in fighting Iran, in joining Israel for that purpose, and essentially neglecting the Palestinians. My one point that I would like to just emphasize is, if this does continue, and if Yossi is right that there's no interest in a two-state solution, where does that leave Israel? For how long can Israel occupy? For how long can 5 million Palestinians remain in Gaza? And does this not end in a one-state solution where, in fact, Israel will either be a democracy and there will be a majority of Palestinians and Arabs, or it will be an apartheid state where a minority of Jewish Israelis will rule over a majority of Palestinians?
So that's a great question. Let's let Yossi answer that question. That's a core issue.
John, to call for a settlement freeze is not naive. I don't believe it's naive. I believe it is essential. What I think is naive is to believe that a settlement freeze would somehow really begin a process that could take us back to the 1990s. That's finished. The Oslo model is dead and buried, and it will not be resurrected. And I say that with a great deal of regret, because I am a passionate supporter of a two-state solution for all the reasons that you mentioned, and more. And I know the need for ending the occupation because I've served in the army. I've served in Gaza, and I know what an occupation looks like from the inside, and I hate it. And I don't want that to be a permanent feature of Israeli life. So yes, I'm with you. Where I profoundly disagree with you is the notion that approaches that fail time and time again can simply be tinkered with and resuscitated. What I'm looking at is, and here I'll speak conceptually, we need a new conceptual basis for peace. And that is to stop the fiction that each side is prepared to really compromise and each side believes that only part of the land belongs to them. I have never met a Palestinian, this is a big statement, but I have never met a Palestinian, including moderate Palestinians, who don't believe that at least in principle, all of the land between the river and the sea is Palestine. Now that doesn't trouble me because from my normative Israeli point of view, all of the land between the river and the sea is the land of Israel. The question is that your starting point or your end point? For me, it's my starting point. My end point is there's another people with whom I share the land. We need to figure out a way of dividing this land in a way that is not just the physical division of the land, but is partitioning what each side believes to be justice. Because if I believe that all the land belongs to me, then I'm not giving back land, I'm giving up land. Just as Palestinians, if they make peace with the state of Israel, they're not giving back. They are giving up something that belongs to them. But the starting point needs to be a frank understanding that this is an existential conflict between two peoples, each of whom believes deeply that all of this little land belongs to them. Then the question becomes is what do you do about that?
Let me ask you both a question. I know both of you have participated in dialogues with Palestinians at different points, and almost everything you've said has actually been discussed in private, in smaller groups with influential thinkers on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side. But those efforts have never, to use a modern word, scaled. They've never really influenced the political process in any meaningful way. And I think that's what feeds the pessimism that we've been talking about in different ways. Why are the kinds of conversations, Yossi, that you just talked about, where neither side talks about giving back, but both sides talk about giving up? Why do those kinds of conversations not get into the politics in either Palestine or in Israel in any meaningful way?
Look, I have to tell you that fortunately, I'm not a politician and I'm not a diplomat. I'm just a writer. And as a writer, my job is to try to communicate. And 2 years ago, I published a book, a series of letters to my Palestinian neighbors. The book was translated into Arabic and put online for free downloading.
A really good read for everybody.
Oh, thank you. And the book is an attempt to explain how I, as an Israeli, experience this conflict, what the Jewish narrative is, and inviting Palestinians and others in the Middle East to write to me. I have a website in Arabic and in Hebrew. And I published an update to the book last year, paperback edition, with a 50-page epilogue from Palestinians who responded and gave their narrative. And I decided to end the book with those Palestinian narratives, even though this was a book that was written to defend the Israeli narrative, try to model what a respectful disagreement over irreconcilable narratives might look like. Now, if you're asking me how to make the leap from that work to the negotiating table, my candid answer to you, Janice, is I don't know. But that's not my job. That's John's job. My job is to try to create some language with which Palestinians and Israelis can begin speaking in a way that we haven't spoken to each other before. And whether I succeed or fail really depends on the quality of that.
Rory, do we have another few minutes? I'm just looking, can we keep going another few minutes or are we out of time?
Yeah, I think we could definitely do a few more minutes. This has been really really interesting. Just want to intervene for those who maybe don't have their chat open. We posed the question of whether there's hope for a two-state solution over the next 20 years. 73% of our audience believes there's hope for a two-state solution in the next. There you go. There's a poll coming up. Oh, we're down to 70%. The numbers are changing as Yossi speaks. Okay, back to you, Janice.
John, certainly in other conflicts, and you made this point earlier in the conversation, you said there's a tendency for Israelis and Palestinians to think I would use the word unique, and there's good reasons for that for anybody who lives in this part of the world to think they're unique. But we know from other parts of the world of very intractable conflicts, there have been breakthroughs. What would, beyond the specific terms here, because we've been talking about these terms for 100 years in one variation or other, what would have to happen to move the kind of work that Yossi is doing beyond a large readership, but into the political process and produce a breakthrough?
Well, to be honest with you, we're not that far from a time when Ehud Olmert, who started out as a right-winger and a mayor of Jerusalem, saw the wisdom of trying to make peace. Now, you know, there are people that say, oh my God, he put a peace plan to the Palestinians and they rejected it. He put a peace plan on a piece of paper 6 weeks before he was about to be indicted and left it with Abbas, and who was going to deliver it. We don't have to go into that. Tzipi Livni, not so long ago, and continues to talk about the dangers of moving forward towards a one-state solution. The peace plan that was negotiated with Barak, you don't have to start from scratch. I don't think you have to start from scratch.
But what was the political consensus for it? Leave aside the specifics of the terms. What we've learned from years and years of work is if you don't have a political consensus for it, even the best terms are not going to cross the line, frankly. What can build a political consensus broader beyond the officials and the diplomats in the broader political process?
That's a very good point. I'm on the board of an organization right now called Project Rosanna. And what is Project Rosanna doing? It's trying to bring Palestinians and Israelis together via the medical sector. Well, I won't go into the details, but the bottom line is this. Since the end of Oslo, since the end of the Second Intifada, Israelis and Palestinians don't know each other. They don't see each other. The only time a Palestinian sees an Israeli is at a border checkpoint or in a prison or a settler who's destroying his olive grove. And Israelis don't see Palestinians anymore. Palestinians used to work in Israel. Palestinians used to swim on the beaches of Tel Aviv. Israelis used to have their cars fixed in Palestinian villages. They don't see themselves as people, and therefore they can't understand the needs and the desires of the other anymore. We've got this generation of young people that Yossi's described that never saw Rabin, never understood peace, and have had leadership in Israel that was essentially opposed to the two-state solution without giving an answer. So what I'm saying is create the conditions where you relax with security, you relax the kind of activities that the IDF is involved in the West Bank.
Is that possible? How do we, in fact, follow up on John's suggestion?
Well, look, you know, this is a direction that I've been trying to go in as well. That's the work that I'm doing, and I agree very much with you, John. The problem that I have with your overarching political analysis is that you seem to feel that if only we change the leadership in Israel, we'll have a reasonable leadership on the Palestinian side. I agree with you about the current leadership in Israel. I profoundly disagree with you about the leadership on the Palestinian side. The Palestinian leadership is as unprepared to make peace as Netanyahu is. And so that's why I keep going back to, on the one hand, grassroots work, people-to-people encounters, yes. But in terms of the future of negotiations, it will be between Israel and the Arab world, and not between Israel and the Palestinian National Movement. At least not in the initial stages.
My only
Let me
response.
try out one idea on the two of you in the last 2 or 3 minutes that we have. I vividly recollect, and there was an example of this, of course, at the end of the Israel period in Lebanon, which actually was instrumental in forcing the withdrawal, and in Ireland, where mothers got together and organized demonstrations in the street saying enough, enough. The casualties, the violence, the harm is enough. And it actually galvanized political opinion in Israel, which led to the withdrawal of Israeli forces. It became absolutely impossible for the government. And in Ireland, that was the breakthrough moment that led to the Good Friday Agreement. So what can you each, and this is why I want to close on a more optimistic note here, first to John, then to Yossi for our last round. What could you imagine, John, coming from civil society in Palestine or Israel that would create that kind of galvanizing change that would just force the politics to veer off the rut that they're currently in?
Well, I can't give you the magic wand, Janice, and I'm sorry I have to come back to this, but what has to stop is the repression. You cannot continue to treat young people in Gaza the way they've been treated and then expect them to all of a sudden embrace the giving up of land, which they will have to do. If you send a signal that you're ready to talk, if you send a signal from high up in Israel that enough is enough and that we are prepared to engage with you, then you can expect, hopefully, I can't predict, but you can hopefully, from the young people who are looking for a way out of this morass, you can expect perhaps, okay, we're prepared to begin to have a conversation. Right now, there's no conversation to be had. And
What could you imagine?
So I would say, first of all, John, you get it half right. Yes, Israel needs to change its policies. And yes, the Palestinian National Movement needs to understand that you can't expect Israelis to be enthusiastic about peace when all we hear from the Palestinian National Movement is that we don't have the right to exist and that they're going to one day drive us out of here. Now, in terms of what the conversation needs to be, both sides need to begin a conversation where each recognizes the indigenousness, the legitimacy of the other side. And that's something, John, that the Palestinian leadership is as far removed from doing as Netanyahu and the Israeli right is doing. And when you only put the onus on Israel, what you're doing is reinforcing the mistakes that the international community has made for 20 years. Now, what we need to do, what we need, now let me finish. What we need to do on the ground here, Janice, is have these kinds of conversations, not between me and academics in Canada, but between me and my neighbor across the wall. And there I agree with John, and I appreciate the work you're doing, John, and I want to strengthen your hand in that work. Less blame, unilateral blame on one side, on Israel, and more constructive work in understanding that one of the main reasons that we've reached this impasse is because we are, after 100 years of the Arab world and Palestinian National Movement saying to the Jewish people, you have no right to be here.
So on this note, I want to thank John and Yossi, and I want also to say that each of them in their personal and professional lives does the work John through the Rosanna Project, which is an exemplar of what we've been talking about, and Yossi in work that you do on narratives. If we had more of you sprinkled in the societies we're talking about, we probably wouldn't be having these conversations. So thank you very much, both of you, for making time for this today. I know our audience is grateful. We didn't get to all the questions, but we got to many of them. And thank you to the CIC and to Rory for enabling this conversation.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you very much, Janice. So I just a couple of conclusion remarks, and thank you also to the panel. This was excellent. That hour flew by for me. So we have one last poll here, which we're going to get Daniel to bring up right now. And we just want to know what your opinion about online versus in-person panels, because, you know, we couldn't have Yossi in Hamilton, and even, you know, forcing John and Janice down the Gardner is also an issue. So I would love to hear what you think about this. We still have almost all of our attendees stuck around as well. So that just shows how interesting this panel was. And you're probably too busy to look at the chat, but there was a lot of engagement there as well. So I hope you can have a look at that after. The chat will be saved. And we're also live on Facebook. So just as you finish off that poll there, just a reminder, please consider joining CIC. The link is there in the chat. And we've got some great events coming up as well. So one is with Craig Kilford coming up on Turkey. So consider signing up for that. So Daniel, if you could close that poll, we'll get the results and we'll call it a day. All right, so a clear majority of people would like to see a mix of both in-person and Zoom virtual events. We didn't do virtual events too much before COVID-19, so this is great news. Thank you everyone for participating, and we're gonna close the call now. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye, and everybody stay well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
See you.